I came home after 6 months away, expecting peace, but what I found stole my breath. 3 cabins on my land, strangers living where my family's memories were rooted. The HOA was gone, yet the betrayal lingered. Footsteps in the mist, shadows watching, letters threatening my family, and a man who thought he could rewrite history. Every day I felt the weight of injustice, the anger of stolen dreams. But something deep inside me refused to back down. This is the story of how land, legacy, and truth collided, how greed met karma, and how I fought to reclaim what was mine. Stay with me, because what happens next is not just property, it's justice delivered in full force. If you want to be part of something truly unique on this channel, hit like, subscribe, and press the bell icon, so you never miss the exciting, gripping stories I bring to you next. The road to Cedar Hollow twisted like a forgotten memory, narrow and half swallowed by fallen pine needles. My truck's tires crunched against the gravel, the rhythm echoing in my chest like a heartbeat I hadn't felt in months. I rolled down the window, breathing in the scent of damp soil and distant rain. It was early evening, the sky heavy with gray clouds that dimmed the sunlight into a pale gold. 6 months away had felt like a lifetime, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. When I finally turned into the lane that led to my property, my breath caught in my throat. The lot, my lot, was no longer mine in spirit. 3 wooden cabins stood in the center, arranged like a mockery of peace. Their roofs gleamed with fresh tin, and porch lights flickered faintly in the mist. It was as if strangers had built a village on my heart. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather creaking beneath my fingers. I parked and stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The smell of sawdust still lingered, sharp and new, mixed with the faint smoke of a nearby fire pit. For a moment, I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn. But then I saw it. The oak tree at the corner of the lot. My father's oak tree. Its gnarled trunk and twisted branches reached out like old arms, whispering the truth I didn't want to face. This was my land, and someone had stolen it. A "For Rent" sign hung crookedly near the first cabin. The bold red letters screamed at me, half buried in mud. My pulse quickened. My property, the one I had paid for, nurtured, protected, was now a business for someone else. I could almost hear my father's voice in the wind, steady and disbelieving. "They can't take what's yours, son." I knocked on the first cabin's door. It opened just a few inches, enough for a woman's wary eyes to meet mine. Her face was unfamiliar, tired but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked, clutching a small towel like a shield. "I think you're living on my property," I managed to say, though my throat was dry. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Oh no, this place belongs to the HOA. I'm renting it from them. Talk to Mr. Hale, the president." The name hit me like a nail to the chest. Martin Hale. My old neighbor. The man who once smiled at every meeting, who claimed the HOA's goal was to protect our values. He had fined me for painting my fence gray instead of beige. He had threatened to tow my truck because it was too large for the aesthetic. And now, apparently, he had sold my land. I thanked the woman quietly and walked away. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the cabins like smoke. Each window glowed faintly. Warm light, laughter, the sound of life that wasn't mine. I could feel anger clawing at the edges of my ribs, but deeper than anger was something colder, disbelief. The kind that numbs you from the inside. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in my truck, parked at the edge of the property, headlights off. The cabins stood there in silence, the sound of rain tapping gently on their roofs. I thought of my father again, of the years we spent clearing this land together, hammering fence posts, planting trees. Every inch of soil was a memory, a promise. I stared at the "For Rent" sign through the drizzle and whispered to myself, "Not for long." The next morning, I drove into town. The county records office smelled of dust and old paper, the kind that clings to your hands. I gave the clerk my parcel number, and she frowned at the computer screen. "That HOA was dissolved 6 months ago," she said quietly. They don't exist anymore. My heart skipped. Then who authorized this construction? She hesitated. Someone's been filing under their name. But legally, that's impossible. I walked out into the sunlight, the information swirling in my mind like a storm. If the HOA no longer existed, then whoever built those cabins had no right. The betrayal ran deep. Martin Hale's smiling face haunted my memory, the way he'd pat my shoulder during meetings and say, "Trust me, we're building a community." Now, that same community had built on my grief. By dusk, I was back on my lot. The wind carried the scent of sawdust again, mixing with the earthy smell of pine. The cabins looked smaller now, less menacing, but still wrong, like scars on familiar skin. I walked along the boundary line, tracing where my father and I once drove wooden stakes into the ground. The markers were gone, replaced with gravel paths and decorative stones. Under the old oak, I stopped. The earth here felt alive, humming faintly under my boot. I placed my hand on the bark and closed my eyes. The wind whispered through the branches, and I thought I could almost hear my father's voice again, calm, steady, patient. Land remembers its keeper. I opened my eyes, my chest tightening with resolve. I didn't know how yet, but I would take it back. Every inch, every nail, every breath of this soil would belong to me again. As I turned back toward my truck, lightning flashed in the distance, splitting the sky in half. The thunder followed, deep, slow, echoing. It sounded like justice waking up. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. Each morning, mist rolled down the mountain like slow-moving smoke, swallowing Cedar Hollow in gray silence. I spent those days inside the county archives, surrounded by boxes of forgotten paperwork and the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights. My coffee went cold before I could finish it. But I didn't care. I was looking for one thing, proof that the land was still mine. The clerk, a tired woman named Helen, helped me pull every file with the HOA's name on it. The records smelled of mildew and time. Most were minutes from meetings, filled with notes about fence colors and lawn rules. But buried in one folder, I found something strange. A construction approval form, signed 3 months ago by Martin Hale, authorizing community development cabins. The HOA seal was stamped on it, but the document date was after the HOA's official dissolution. I stared at the paper, my pulse quickening. How could he still sign this? I asked. Helen leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. He couldn't, she said softly. Unless someone forged continuity. Those words echoed in my head like footsteps in an empty hall. Someone had resurrected the HOA's identity to steal my property. I scanned the signatures again, all familiar names, neighbors who once smiled at me over fences and bake sales. Were they all in on it? That evening, I drove past their houses. The neighborhood looked the same, perfect lawns, trimmed hedges, porch lights glowing against the drizzle. But behind every window I saw curtains twitch, shadows moving, whispers. They knew I was back, and maybe they feared what I had found. I spent the night in my truck again, parked at the edge of my land. The cabins glowed faintly through the fog, their windows reflecting my headlights like eyes watching me. One of the tenants, a man in a gray jacket, came out to smoke. He looked around nervously, then disappeared inside. They didn't know they were part of something rotten. When dawn broke, I walked through the wet grass toward the first cabin. My boots sank into the mud. The "For Rent" sign had fallen, half buried now, its red letters fading. I found an envelope tucked under it, sealed in plastic, an old HOA notice, warning of delinquent dues and property reassignment. It was addressed to me. My name scrawled in cheap ink, the letter dated during my absence. It hit me then, they had planned this from the start. The HOA had found me out, declared my property abandoned, and sold it to themselves before dissolving. It wasn't just theft, it was a quiet execution of trust. I drove to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Sheriff Dalton was a large man with eyes that had seen too many small-town feuds. He read through the papers slowly, his jaw tightening. "This looks bad," he muttered. But Hale's got friends in half the county offices. You'll need hard proof. Witnesses, statements, everything. I'll find it, I said, my voice steady. Days turned into weeks. I gathered documents, took photographs, recorded testimonies from the tenants. Some told me Hale promised them low-cost rentals. Others said they were told it was part of a mountain resort project. All had paid deposits directly to a fake HOA account. I traced the payments. They led straight to a private company under Hale's name. Every night, I worked under the glow of a single lantern, spreading files across my dining table. Rain drummed against the windows like a ticking clock. I barely slept. My mind ran circles around the same question: why my land? Maybe it was because it sat near the stream, the most valuable corner in Cedar Hollow. Or maybe it was because I'd been the only one who ever stood up to Hale in those meetings. I remembered the last one vividly. The way his smile faltered when I refused to pay a beautification fee for a tree I never planted. He'd said, "You'll regret not playing along." Now I understood. A week later, I received an anonymous email. No name, no greeting, just a scanned copy of a contract and the words, "He forged the HOA seal. Check the notary's signature." I stared at the document for hours, comparing the handwriting. It was undeniable. The notary's signature was fake, traced from another document dated 2 years earlier. Hale had used the dead HOA to build his empire of lies. I printed everything and drove to the county courthouse. The wind howled through the narrow streets, scattering dry leaves in spirals. My boots echoed against the marble floor as I submitted the evidence. The clerk looked at the stack of papers, then up at me. "If this is real," she said, "you might get your land back, and he might go to prison." The next morning, deputies showed up at the cabins. I watched from the road as they taped bright yellow notices across each door. "Property under investigation." Tenants came out, confused, holding boxes, some crying. I felt a mix of guilt and relief. None of this was their fault. They were victims too. That night, the mountain was silent again. The cabins stood dark and empty, rain tapping gently on their roofs. I sat beneath my father's oak tree, the cold seeping into my jeans. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm doing what you'd have done." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of cedar and soil. For the first time in months, I felt I wasn't alone. 2 days later, the sheriff called. "We've got him," he said. "Caught trying to transfer the fake HOA funds out of state. He's in custody." I drove down to the station. Through the small window of the holding cell, I saw Martin Hale sitting hunched over, his once slick hair now a mess, his confident grin gone. When our eyes met, something inside me shifted. He looked smaller, not the monster I'd built in my mind, but a man crushed by his own greed. As I turned to leave, the sheriff said quietly, "You did right, son. But remember, justice takes time." I nodded, stepping out into the cold evening. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the clouds with streaks of orange and violet. I breathed in deeply. The air felt cleaner, lighter. But I knew it wasn't over yet. There would be hearings, paperwork, repairs. Still, as I looked back at the cabins silhouetted against the dusk, I felt something stronger than anger: purpose. The land had chosen its keeper again, and I wasn't going anywhere. The last light of day disappeared behind the ridge, and the night rose like a curtain. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, not threatening, but steady, like a promise. Justice was coming. The day of the hearing arrived under a bruised sky. Dawn spilled over the mountains like pale smoke, and the town still felt half asleep. I stood outside the courthouse, clutching a worn folder, my entire life reduced to paper and ink. The air smelled of wet asphalt and coffee drifting from a food truck parked nearby. I hadn't eaten. My stomach twisted in knots, half fear, half anticipation. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I expected. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of nervous neighbors. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of guilt. I could feel their stares as I took my seat near the front. Across the aisle sat Martin Hale, his once proud posture slumped. His lawyer whispered something, but he barely nodded. The judge entered, a tall woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through lies. She glanced briefly at me before calling the session to order. Her voice echoed through the chamber, calm and deliberate, like someone who had heard every kind of truth and deception before. The prosecutor began, laying out the evidence I had spent months gathering: the forged documents, fake notary seals, bank transfers. Each photograph, each printed email felt like a heartbeat echoing in the stillness. When they showed the construction approval form with the counterfeit HOA seal, a murmur rippled through the room. Hale didn't lift his head. When my turn came to testify, I stood slowly, my palms slick with sweat. The microphone crackled as I spoke. "This land wasn't just property," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a legacy. My father built our first fence with his hands. We planted the oak tree together. I left for 6 months, and came back to find strangers living on what he left behind." I took a breath. The HOA told everyone it was community development. But there was no community, just one man's greed. The judge listened, her gaze unblinking. For a moment, the courtroom was so silent I could hear the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Then the defense rose. Hale's lawyer, a thin man with silver glasses, argued that clerical errors caused confusion. "My client never intended harm," he said smoothly. "He acted in good faith under what he believed were valid documents." The words stung. Good faith. I clenched my jaw. There was nothing good about stealing someone's past. The prosecutor handed over the final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Hale and one of the tenants, secretly captured by a deputy. Hale's voice filled the room. "He won't come back. He never does. It's free money while it lasts." Gasps broke out among the crowd. Hale's shoulders slumped further. The judge's expression hardened, a shadow crossing her face. "Mr. Hale," she said slowly, "you used a dissolved organization to commit fraud, theft, and misrepresentation. You violated trust on every level." Hale said nothing. His eyes flickered briefly toward me, then down again. I couldn't tell if it was regret or resentment. Maybe both. The verdict came before noon. Guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel struck wood, and the sound echoed like thunder rolling down the valley. Hale was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to repay every stolen dollar. But none of that mattered as much as what she said next. "This court recognizes the original deed holder, Mr. Daniel Morris, as the rightful owner of the property in question," she declared. For a second I couldn't move. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. I felt my breath catch, my chest trembling. My father's land returned. As I walked out of the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, sharper, like the world had exhaled. The clouds above were breaking apart, shafts of sunlight piercing through in narrow beams. I stood on the courthouse steps and closed my eyes, feeling the warmth on my face. Neighbors came up to me, some apologetic, some merely curious. A few offered awkward congratulations, but I could sense their unease. Cedar Hollow was a small town. Everyone had known, deep down, what Hale was doing. They just didn't want to see it. That evening, I drove back to my land. The cabins stood silent, their windows boarded for inspection. The grass had grown wild again, reclaiming the paths Hale's workers had cut. The oak tree swayed gently in the wind, leaves whispering secrets to the fading light. I stepped out of my truck and placed my hand against its bark. "You were right," I whispered to the tree, or maybe to my father's memory. "Land remembers its keeper." The next few weeks were spent cleaning up what remained. The cabins were in rough shape, mold creeping through the walls, debris scattered across the floors. But I didn't tear them down. Not yet. Something inside me said there was a way to turn this pain into something good. I met with a local charity group that helped displaced families. When they heard my story, they offered to help renovate the cabins. "You could turn this into a refuge," one volunteer suggested. A place for people to start over. The idea settled deep in my chest. Maybe justice wasn't just about taking back what was stolen, maybe it was about giving it new life. I spent the rest of the season rebuilding. My hands blistered, my back ached, but the work felt sacred. Every nail I drove into those cabin walls was a prayer, every repaired window a memory sealed with purpose. The smell of sawdust returned, but this time, it carried hope instead of betrayal. When the first family moved in, a young mother with 2 children, I stood at a distance and watched their laughter fill the air. The same soil that once held deceit now held joy. It was as if the land itself was healing, forgiving, remembering. At night, when the lights from the cabins glowed across the lot, I'd sit under the oak tree, listening to the sounds of life, footsteps, distant music, soft laughter. The same wind that once carried my anger now brought peace. And in those quiet moments, I realized something my father must have known all along, that justice isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of healing. The first morning after the verdict felt unreal, like waking from a long nightmare. The mist still rolled low over the valley, but the air smelled cleaner, fresher. My boots crunched over gravel as I stepped onto my land, for the first time without fear of being told to leave. The cabins stood quiet, weathered and hollow, like empty shells of someone else's greed. Their roofs sagged slightly, and the paint peeled from the siding. I walked among them slowly, running my hand along the rough wood, tracing the story of every scar they carried. Each nail hammered in by stolen hands. Each board a witness. But I didn't feel hatred anymore, only resolve. I decided then that I wouldn't tear them down. I'd rebuild them. Not for profit, not for revenge, but to give the land a new voice. A purpose that healed what had been broken. I called a few old friends, people who still believed in second chances. Sam, who owned the hardware store in town, showed up with a truck full of supplies. "No charge," he said with a grin. "Call it redemption for all the times I turned a blind eye." By noon, we were hauling out debris, sweeping dust from the floors, and ripping down rotten boards. The cabins echoed with the sound of hammers and laughter, a strange symphony of renewal. The air filled again with the scent of sawdust, but this time it smelled like home. As days turned into weeks, volunteers began to trickle in. Some were neighbors who'd once avoided me out of shame. Others were strangers who had read my story in the local paper. A few came just to offer food or tools. One woman, Clara, a retired carpenter with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, joined us every day. "Land holds memories," she told me one afternoon as we patched the roof of cabin 3. "But it forgives faster than people do. You give it purpose again, it'll give you peace." Her words stayed with me. By late summer, the cabins began to change. Fresh paint replaced the decay. Windows gleamed under the sun. The overgrown fields were cleared and seeded with wildflowers. Even the oak tree seemed to stand taller, its branches swaying proudly in the breeze. But the transformation wasn't just in the land, it was in me. Every hammer strike drove out another fragment of bitterness. Every repaired wall felt like stitching up an old wound. There were moments when exhaustion nearly broke me, nights when I'd collapse on the porch with aching hands and a burning back, but I'd look at the stars, and something in their cold light whispered, "Keep going." One evening, I found a faded photograph under one of the cabin floors, a picture of Martin Hale, taken years ago. He stood smiling in front of a "Welcome to Cedar Hollow HOA" sign, flanked by other board members. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel anger anymore, just pity. That night, I burned the photo in a metal barrel behind the shed. The flame caught slow, curling the paper at the edges before consuming it completely. As it turned to ash, I whispered, "You don't own this story anymore." By autumn, the project had a name, Hollow Haven, a refuge for displaced families, veterans, and anyone who needed a place to start over. The first family had already moved in, a mother and her 2 children, and 3 more cabins were nearly ready. The laughter of kids running through the fields felt like the sound of justice finally breathing again. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, I sat on the steps of Cabin 1, sipping coffee while the air shimmered gold. Clara joined me, dust on her hands and a tired smile on her face. "You did good, Daniel," she said quietly. "We did," I replied. She chuckled softly. "You know, there's something poetic about turning a scam into a sanctuary." I smiled at that. "Yeah," I said. "Maybe that's what this land wanted all along, to be more than just ownership. To belong to something good." But the peace I'd found was fragile, I could feel it. Because as Hollow Haven grew, so did attention. A few developers started showing up again, offering to buy the property, promising better use for the land. They came with smooth smiles and glossy brochures, talking about eco-luxury cabins and sustainable vacation retreats. I refused every offer. But one evening, I found a letter pinned to the fence. No name, just a warning written in rough ink. "You think the fight's over. It isn't. Some of us lost money when hail fell. We'll take it back one way or another." I read it twice, my heart thudding. The old fear I thought I'd buried started to stir again, that sense of being watched, stalked by something you can't quite see. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my pocket. The next morning, I found tire tracks near the back fence, fresh ones. Someone had been there during the night. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I kept working, hammering, painting, pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was creeping back into Cedar Hollow, something that wanted what I'd built to crumble. That night, as wind howled through the trees, I stood by the oak again. Its branches creaked softly in the dark. "Whatever comes next," I whispered, "I won't run this time." The wind answered with a sigh that almost sounded like a promise. I turned toward the glowing cabins, their warm lights flickering against the dusk. Families laughed inside, unaware of the shadows gathering just beyond the fence line. The fight wasn't over, it was just changing shape. And I was ready. The nights in Cedar Hollow had changed. Once, the crickets sang freely, and the trees whispered softly in the wind. But lately, silence had taken root. It was the kind of silence that crawled under your skin, heavy, alert, waiting for something to happen. I started noticing small things first. Tools going missing. A ladder left halfway down when I knew I'd put it away. Fresh footprints near the back fence after rain. They weren't from the volunteers. I knew every pair of boots on this land. These prints were different. Heavier. Deliberate. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I wanted to believe that the peace we'd earned couldn't be broken. But then came the nights when the dogs barked at the darkness for hours, staring toward the treeline as if they saw something I couldn't. I tried to sleep through it, but the memories of that warning note gnawed at me. Some of us lost money when hail fell. We'll take it back. It was no longer a threat. It was a promise. One evening, as I was locking up cabin 3 after fixing a window latch, I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. A dark figure standing beyond the oak tree, watching. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. The figure didn't move for several seconds, then turned and slipped silently into the woods. I ran toward the spot, flashlight cutting through the shadows. But when I reached the trees, there was nothing. Only the smell of damp leaves and the sound of wind. No footprints. No sign. As if he'd never been there. The next morning, the families staying at Hollow Haven noticed things too. The mother in cabin 1 told me her door had been found slightly open, even though she always locked it. Someone had taken an old radio from the porch. Small things, but enough to plant fear. I called the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy, young, polite, and clearly overworked. He took my statement, walked the perimeter, and shrugged. "Could be kids," he said. "Or someone passing through. I'll add a note, but unless there's damage, there's not much we can do." It wasn't enough. I started keeping a rifle near the door again, just in case. One night, rain came, a steady, cold drizzle that turned the dirt road into a stream. The wind moaned through the trees, and the cabins glowed dimly through the mist. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it, a faint metallic clank from outside, followed by the sound of something dragging. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the rain. The beam sliced through the gray, landing on the shed door, swinging wide open. Inside, the shelves were overturned. Tools scattered. Someone had been searching for something. And then I saw it, carved into the wood above the doorway, crude and jagged. "You shouldn't have come back." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled, the rain mixing with sweat on my skin. Whoever was doing this wanted me scared. They wanted me to feel helpless again. But fear wasn't going to win this time. The next morning, I gathered everyone in the main cabin. "No one goes anywhere alone," I told them. "Keep your lights on at night. Lock everything." I called Sam, and he came with a few men from town. We installed cameras, motion lights, and even reinforced the gate. But part of me knew, this wasn't just vandalism. This was personal. Someone was trying to break the spirit of Hollow Haven. A few days later, Clara showed up early, her face pale. She handed me a crumpled flyer she'd found posted on the town notice board. It was an old HOA notice, reprinted with fresh ink, stamped with a fake seal. It claimed the land was still under HOA dispute, warning that anyone living there would soon be evicted under state property code. It was absurd. The HOA was gone. Legally dissolved. But the fear it stirred was real. Some of the new residents packed their things that same day. I couldn't stop them. I watched as a young mother loaded her car, tears in her eyes, whispering, "I can't risk my kids." The sight broke something inside me. That evening, I walked to the oak tree again. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. I placed my palm against the bark and closed my eyes. "I thought I'd beaten this," I whispered. "Why won't it end?" The wind rustled the leaves, carrying a low groan through the branches. It almost sounded like an answer, because you haven't faced the last of them. Later that night, as lightning flashed across the sky, the power went out. The cabins went dark. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside. The storm howled, trees bending in the wind. And through the rain, I saw them, 3 figures standing by the fence line, half hidden in the downpour. I shouted, "Who's there?" They didn't respond. One of them stepped forward, tall, wearing a hood. His voice cut through the rain. "This land doesn't belong to you. It never belonged to you either." I yelled back. A moment of silence hung between us, filled with the hiss of rain. Then they turned and vanished into the trees, their shadows swallowed by darkness. I stood there for a long time, rain soaking through my clothes, heart pounding. When I finally went back inside, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about me anymore. Hollow Haven was more than land. It was proof that justice could rebuild. And whoever these men were, they wanted to erase that. The next morning, I drove to town and met with a lawyer who had once fought against the old HOA. Together, we began gathering records. Property filings, the dissolution documents, every piece of paper proving that Cedar Hollow's tyranny was dead. Because this time, I wouldn't fight in shadows. I'd bring everything into the light. But before I could even file the paperwork, something happened that changed everything again. When I returned that evening, the cabins were quiet. Too quiet. The air smelled faintly of smoke. My chest tightened as I ran toward cabin 2, and stopped dead. The porch was scorched black. The window shattered. Inside, the floorboards were charred, and smoke still rose from the walls. Someone had tried to burn it. I fell to my knees, staring at the wreckage as the wind howled through the broken glass. The rain began to fall again, slow, steady, relentless. It wasn't just vandalism anymore. It was war. And this time, I was ready to fight back. The smoke lingered in the air for 2 days. Even after the rain washed the ashes from the porch, the scent of burning would clung to the land, a grim reminder of what hatred could do. I didn't sleep. I patrolled the property at night with a flashlight in one hand and the rifle in the other, waiting for the shadows to return. They didn't. Not yet. The sheriff's department came, took pictures, made notes, and left with vague promises of further investigation. But I knew the truth. This wasn't something they'd solve. The people behind it weren't just angry ex-HOA members or vengeful developers. They were men who had lived off corruption, who couldn't stand seeing this land thrive under honesty. For them, Hollow Haven was a wound that refused to close. The families who had stayed were terrified. Some packed their bags and left under the cover of night. I couldn't blame them. But Clara stayed. Sam stayed. And a few others too. People who had seen enough injustice in their lives to know that running only made it grow stronger. "We'll rebuild again," Clara said, her voice steady as she shoveled the last of the ash into a metal bin. "Let them burn what they want. They can't burn faith." Her words lit a small fire in me, the right kind this time. That night, I called the local news. Then I called the state property board. I showed them everything. Documents, letters, footage from the cameras that caught the silhouettes, the fake HOA notices. Within days, reporters came to Hollow Haven. They filmed the burned cabin, the families rebuilding, the volunteers hammering boards back into place. And then they filmed me, standing beneath the old oak, telling the story from the beginning. I spoke of deceit, of stolen land, of the community that refused to die. My voice shook, but I didn't care. I wanted the world to hear it. The story of a man who came home to find his land stolen and built something honest from the wreckage. The next morning, the story aired. And just like that, the silence was broken. Calls came flooding in. People from nearby towns, even other states, offering help, donations, protection. A local contractor offered to rebuild the burned cabin for free. A retired judge sent a letter promising to reopen the investigation into the dissolved HOA's finances. For the first time, the fight wasn't mine alone. But the ones who had started this war weren't done. 2 nights after the broadcast, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching, a car pulling into the lot. Headlights swept across the cabins, then went dark. I reached for the rifle and stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. The rain had just begun again, soft, cold, rhythmic. 3 men stepped out of the dark SUV. One of them, the tall man from before, raised his hands slowly. "We just want to talk," he said. I kept the light on them. "Talking's not what you've been good at." He smirked faintly. "You've made quite the name for yourself, Daniel. Local hero. Man of justice." His tone dripped with mockery. "But all that publicity? It's bad for business." "I'm not in business," I said. "Oh, but you are," he replied. "You've built something on land that still carries our investment. You think this story ends with a news clip?" I lowered the light slightly, enough to see his face. It was hollow, gaunt, the kind of face carved by greed and sleepless nights. He took a step forward. "Walk away, Daniel. Take your redemption and go. Before someone gets hurt again." My grip tightened on the rifle. "You already hurt enough people." His eyes narrowed. "Then maybe we should finish what we started." Before he could move, headlights flared from behind, Sam's truck barreling down the path, horn blaring. The men froze. Sam jumped out, shotgun in hand, shouting, "Sheriff's on the way." The intruders exchanged looks. The tall man spat on the ground. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You can't fight shadows forever." "Maybe not," I said quietly. "But I can fight you." They backed off, retreating to their SUV and speeding off into the night, their tires kicking mud into the air. The roar of their engine faded into the storm. For a long time, Sam and I stood there in silence, the rain drumming on our coat. He finally said, "You think they'll come back?" I stared into the dark woods beyond the fence. "Not when the light's this bright." And I meant it. By morning, the sheriff's office returned, this time with state investigators. The footage, the threats, the broadcast, it had finally forced action. Within a week, arrests were made. Names surfaced. Developers, investors, even a few former board members of the HOA who had been quietly funneling stolen property through shell companies. The news called it the Cedar Hollow scandal. For me, it was just the end of a long chapter. Weeks passed. The burned cabin was rebuilt, brighter than before. The families who had left began to return. Kids played in the fields again, laughter echoing through the valley. Even the oak tree seemed to bloom fuller that spring, its leaves shimmering with renewed life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the land in amber light, I stood by the rebuilt porch and breathed in the scent of fresh wood. Clara joined me, wiping dust from her hands. "It's finally over," she said softly. I nodded. "For now." She smiled. "And if the shadows come again?" I looked toward the horizon, where the light met the trees. "Then we'll keep rebuilding. Because that's what faith does, it rebuilds." We stood in silence as the sky turned gold. The cabins glowed under the evening sun, and for the first time in years, peace didn't feel temporary. It felt earned. As I walked back toward the oak tree, I ran my hand along its rough bark. "We did it," I whispered. "We brought it back." The wind moved gently through the branches, whispering like a promise. And in that moment I realized, justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet breath after a storm, the laughter of children where there was once silence, the strength to build again where others tried to destroy. Hollow Haven stood as proof that truth, when rooted deep enough, can't be burned down. Not by greed, not by fear, not by shadows, only light remains.